Hello and welcome. In today's video, I want to discuss Rumi's poem, The Guest House, which is a poem that, although it's not itself within the Buddhist tradition, is used a lot in the context of mindfulness, mindfulness meditation, meditation practice generally. And I think we'll see that there are some problems with the poem in various respects. That is to say, the poem that we're often shown isn't really by Rumi. And we'll get to the fact that there are some Buddhist poem, or that is to say a Buddhist poem, that is an interesting kind of foil to this one. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So Rumi's The Guest House. It's a wonderful poem as it's read to us oftentimes when we're in a meditation group. I've had it read to me any number of times. I enjoy the poem. It also plays a central role in what's known as mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR classes, where oftentimes the poem is read as a kind of a bridge between our practice with the body, of learning to become at ease with the feelings that we have in our bodies, and a bridge towards our burgeoning ability to become okay with what's going on in our minds. That is to say, to foster a kind of a mindset of open awareness and open acceptance of the mind itself. Now, I have to read the poem now. I want to read it so that in case you haven't heard it, you know what I'm talking about, and if you have heard it, at least it will refresh your memory. So the poem goes like this. The Guest House. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. They may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from the beyond. And this is a poem, again, Rumi poem, by translation by Coleman Barks. So I want to discuss some issues with this poem, some ways that it's really not what it appears to be, and then get back to our discussion of Buddhism at the end. So in case you're not familiar, Rumi, his name is Jalal ad-Din Muhammad Rumi, who lived from 1207 to 1273. He was a Persian poet and a scholar and a Sufi mystic. And recently, in a few decades ago, in the end of the 20th century, an American poet and a professor of English, Coleman Barks, set out to translate his poetry into English. Now, Coleman Barks, who is the author of the poem that I just read, or the translator, shall we say, we'll get to that, he does not read Persian, so he did not translate the poem out of Persian into English. Rather, he relied on other translations and basically reinterpreted them. And indeed, what others have mentioned, I'm not the first to mention this, there have been articles written about this, what Coleman Barks basically did was to take Rumi's poems and put them into a new form that was more palatable to a modern, shall we say, somewhat secular Western audience. Rumi himself was a very committed Muslim, and so his poetry reflects that commitment to Islam. The Islam and love of Allah and the Muslim religion is simply part and parcel of his poetry. Coleman Barks, however, in working his translations, removed that kind of material, leaving poems that were more general in tone. And in some cases, what Coleman Barks seems to have done is to basically cobble together poems out of lines from one place and another in Rumi's writings. And in fact, The Guest House is one such poem. That is to say, to put it bluntly, there is no poem called The Guest House in Rumi's writings. Rumi didn't write a poem called The Guest House. And the poem that I read to you earlier, therefore, isn't really from Rumi. It's basically parts of Rumi, parts of a very long poem, that are taken somewhat out of context and put together and called a poem called The Guest House. When I was looking for this, to do research for this video, I was looking for other translations of The Guest House to compare. And I became immediately aware that there were no other ones because, again, The Guest House isn't really a poem, or at least a singular poem that he wrote. It is indeed part of a much, much longer poem called the Masnavi, which is a poem in 50,000 lines. It's a very long poem, which is known as the Quran in Persian. It's basically a sort of a magnum opus that Rumi composed over many, many years near the end of his life in 6 volumes. And what Coleman Barks did was to take a couple of snippets from here and from there in book 5 of this huge poem, take snippets and put them together into a single piece. So what I'd like to do here is to look at both sort of side by side Coleman Barks's quote-unquote translation or work and the parts, the selections from the Masnavi that he seems to have gotten his poem from, at least so we can compare them. And so to do that, I'll go over to my computer and we'll take a look. Okay, so what I want to do is to look at this poem in a different translation. This is a translation by Reynold Nicholson, who, as we'll see, is what used to be professor of Arabic and Persian at University of Cambridge in England. The text is called the Masnavi, or this is a different translation of that word is Mathnawi, a different English transliteration is Mathnawi. I'm going to show you the whole poem in a moment, but I do want to begin with to illustrate to you exactly where it appears within this much, much longer text. The book I have in front of you on the screen is volumes 5 and 6, so we've got a lot of material that I'm not showing you. It would take too long to go through it all, obviously. And we zip down through here, and we're trying to get to line, which line is it? 3644. So it goes a long way. I'll leave, by the way, a link to this poem down in the notes, or I should say this translation down in the notes, in case, this interests you and you want to see more. Okay, 3644 is where it starts. It starts right here. This body, O youth, is a guest house. Every morning a new guest comes running into it. And you see that this is just in the middle of the poem. There's a lot of material that comes before it, obviously. It's just in the middle of everything, and then it just keeps going, and it's what Coleman Barks has done is to take a few sentences from this section here, and then a few sentences from a later section, and so on, and then he basically cobbles them all together. And what we end up with is this. So what we have is 2 translations of this very same text. Now, on the left-hand side is the original one, the one that I read to you at the beginning of I shouldn't say the original one, but the one that I read to you at the beginning of this video. And on the right is the poem from the Masnavi, and you'll see it's selections. So we have 3 different, I would say paragraphs, but they're just groups of sentences that seem roughly to correspond to the material that Coleman Barks has pulled out. So I'll just read the Masnavi and the selections. This body, O youth, is a guest house. Every morning a new guest comes running into it. Beware, do not say, this guest is a burden to me, for presently he will fly back into non-existence. Whatsoever comes into thy heart from the invisible world is thy guest. Entertain it well. I say sick means that originally it says they guest. I assume that's a misprint. So that was from a particular section of the Masnavi, but then there's a break. There are many, many lines that he doesn't quote, and then we get back to another thing he quotes, that Coleman Barks quotes. Every day, too, at every moment a different thought comes, like an honored guest into thy bosom. O dear soul, regard thought as a person, since every person derives his worth from thought and spirit. If the thought of sorrow is waylaying or spoiling joy, yet it is making preparations for joy. It violently sweeps thy house clear of all else, in order that new joy from the source of good may enter in. And then we have another break of several lines, and then we get back to a portion that Coleman Barks seems to have liked. Whenever the thought of sorrow comes into thy breast anew, go to meet it with smiles and laughter, saying, O my Creator, preserve me from its evil. Do not deprive me, but let me partake of its good. O my Lord, prompt me to give thanks for that which I see or receive. Do not let me feel any subsequent regret if the benefit received shall pass away. So we see that these two poems are similar. Clearly, this is the place that Coleman Barks got his idea, but they're different. There are significant differences between them. We have the same idea of, for example, sorrows violently sweeping the house empty of furniture in the case of Coleman Barks, or sweeping the house clear of all else in order that new joy from the source of good may enter in the case of Rumi. Now, in the case of Rumi, we have something that's more clearly mentioning Allah, mentioning God, that is the source of good. Joy from the source of good, joy from God will enter in once the house has been cleared. We don't get that so much in Coleman Barks. Again, Coleman Barks has sort of tried to remove the aspects of the poem, or most aspects, that seem to relate to the Muslim faith in it. That is to say, and also later on in the poem, we get in Rumi's version, the idea that we give thanks to the Lord for what we receive. That we're basically supplicating God so as not to feel any regret if the benefit passes away. So we're asking God not to feel regret. We're asking and we're thanking God for the good that we've gotten. That is, that this poem is really more accurately, at least in the original, a paean to God the Creator, since all that we receive, either good or ill, is due to God's will. And the idea being that since God is the source of good, that there is a sense in which everything we receive will eventually be for good. That's the sort of the faith and devotion that's at the heart, I think, of Rumi's poem, that we don't find so much in Coleman Barks. Now, Coleman Barks does at the end talk about a guide from the beyond. Each has been sent as a guide from the beyond, which is really echoing the first part of the original Rumi poem, where he says, whatsoever comes into thy heart from the invisible world is thy guest. But Coleman Barks here is really trying to denude this of any real obvious theological significance. It's just simply a guest from the beyond, whatever that might mean. That's a very vague kind of a sentiment. Now, to be absolutely clear, there's nothing wrong with loving one or another of these poems. There's nothing at all wrong with finding great inspiration in Coleman Barks's work, The Guest House. There's also nothing wrong with taking great inspiration from Rumi's original writings. That's going to be something that's up to you personally. And for myself, I find both of them quite beautiful, and I certainly find Coleman Barks's poem to be beautiful and and moving for my own practice. So again, I don't want to make it seem as though I'm saying there's something wrong here. What I do want to have happen, at least, is that we understand some of the history, because I think doing that gives us a broader and deeper knowledge of what's going on, and more ways to broaden our kind of experience of this poetry in the world. Now, in both examples, in both cases, what we find is a poem that has a lot of resonances with Buddhist practice. This whole idea of sort of welcoming in guests from the outside as kind of a metaphor for welcoming in states of mind and welcoming in experiences, either good or bad, welcoming them all in and entertaining them all, is a very fruitful way of, I think, understanding Buddhist practice. But here's the thing. There actually is a poem within the early Buddhist tradition which is entitled The Guest House. Now, we have to be a little careful here because early Buddhist suttas did not have titles. The titles were given to them later. But I think we'll see immediately that this sutta is, the title that's been given to it is a reasonable title. That's kind of what the subject is of this sutta. And this sutta was not, so far as we know, cobbled together from other material elsewhere. It comes down to us in the Pali tradition in this form. And so the sutta goes like this. Mendicants, suppose there was a guest house. Lodgers come from the east, west, north, and south. Aristocrats, Brahmins, merchants, and workers all stay there. In the same way, various feelings arise in this body, pleasant, painful, and neutral feelings. Now clearly this is just a sketch of an idea, perhaps a sketch of a Dharma talk that the Buddha once gave. It's impossible to know for sure. But it has deep resonances with these poems we've been reading, in particular Coleman Barks's, but all of them really. This idea of the body as a guest house, and that feelings arise and feelings are analogized to the guests that come and go. So, I mean, the body as a guest house means that nobody's going to stay for very long. That is to say, it's not a rooming house, it's not a place where feelings come to remain, but it's rather a place where feelings come to move through. And the idea being that we should learn to have equanimity towards these feelings, whatever they are, because we know that they're not going to be permanent. They're not going to be permanent lodgers. Now, to be clear, this sutta that I've read doesn't actually say we're supposed to be equanimous. The sutta sort of ends before it sort of gets to any kind of a result like that, but I think reasonably that's where we can understand this train of thought to be leading. But this close similarity, both in the title and the subject matter, leads me to wonder if either Coleman Barks or if Rumi himself might have known this sutta from the Buddhist tradition. Now, this sutta does exist in a Chinese recension, which means that it was translated probably into some version of Sanskrit in North India before being translated into Chinese. So it is possible, given that the North Indian translation is near Persia, that it's possible that there was some interchange with the Muslim world, and that the ideas behind such a sutta as this might have been passed into Persia, or perhaps in the present day, the sort of thing that Coleman Barks might have read somewhere. To be clear, I think it's probably doubtful in both cases. Certainly, Rumi, being a devout Muslim, would be unlikely to use something that he knew was expressing a Buddhist idea, although, to be honest, to be fair, Rumi was a Sufi Muslim, which is a very spiritual or esoteric kind of tradition in the Muslim world. And so it certainly is possible that there was some relation between Sufism and Buddhism. I'm not familiar enough with the scholarship on that. Perhaps you would know more. If you do, feel free to leave a note down below in the comments. I'd be fascinated to know more. Now, this whole issue of Coleman Barks's quote-unquote translations, which really aren't quite translations, they're more his own works, may remind some of us of a recent issue within Buddhism, where a recent Buddhist practitioner named Matti Weingast purported to be translating a bunch of poems of the early Buddhist nuns into English. And it turned out that these were not really translations, but rather his own original kinds of poems that were sort of put into the mouths of ancient Buddhist nuns. Now, there was enough of an uproar about that subject within Buddhism that the publisher Shambhala has decided to re-release the book, making it clearer that the poems in the book are not actually original, they're not translations. It's not really clear yet whether this has gone far enough or whether they're leaving a door sort of cracked open to the possibility of them being translations. We'll have to wait and see, and that there's already been some controversy over exactly what is being said about this new book, or this new release of the book by Matti Weingast. And people have already made this kind of comparison between Matti Weingast and Coleman Barks. Coleman Barks' work with Rumi. But I think the bigger problem, I think, with Coleman Barks is that his work is still being sold today as translations of Rumi, when I think that is really not a very accurate way to understand what he has done in general, at least in my understanding of it. In any event, if you want to see the video that I did recently about Matti Weingast's issue with the Buddhist nuns, I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, please consider taking a look over at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help support the channel. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you in the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.